My fellow citizens, friends beyond our borders, and everyone gathered here by conscience and curiosity, tonight I speak about an episode that began as an effort to punish and instead revealed the strength of a people, the fragility of authority when divorced from legitimacy, and the unexpected ways in which power rebounds when it is applied without care. It began with a decision in a courtroom. A judge, whom I will call Judge Thomas, pressed hard to urge his government to impose sanctions on a national leader. The charge, the anxieties, the legal arguments, they populated headlines and late-night conversations. The motive, plainly stated, was to hold someone accountable. The instrument chosen was the harshest of levers, sanctions that would touch the lives of ordinary citizens, the economy of the state, and the diplomatic posture of nations. Those who believe in strong accountability applauded the resolve. Those who worry about overreach watched warily, and those who had learned the hard lessons of history, that punishment sometimes lands on the innocent, and that pressure often begets resistance, waited for the dust to settle and for justice to follow its steady course. What we saw instead was something with both sorrow and clarity. The strategy backfired instantly. The intended effect to isolate, to weaken, to coerce, did not play out as planned. Instead, the sanction impulse lit a fuse that spread far beyond the judge's chamber. It rallied the very constituencies the action sought to punish. It hardened popular sympathies. It united skeptical elites, and it pushed the matter beyond legal technicalities into the realm of national dignity. The punishment became a catalyst for solidarity. Understand this, sanctions are not neutral instruments. They carry moral freight, practical consequences, and political symbolism. In some contexts, they are a necessary response to egregious violations. In others, they are blunt instruments applied without regard to nuance, and they inflict harm that extends well beyond the intended target. In this case, the judge's choice to call for sanctions was read by many as an external imposition, an outside lever pressed into the tender machinery of domestic politics. The immediate result was not capitulation. It was confrontation. First, let us look at the domestic politics. For months there had been simmering debates over governance, justice, and the extent to which external actors should weigh in on internal affairs. When the call for sanctions arrived, it crystallized those debates. At once, political actors who had been divided over policy found common cause in defending national dignity. Opposition benches that had criticized the leader's style or decisions stepped back into a broader frame. Civil society groups, labor unions, and market traders, groups ordinarily at odds, recognized a shared stake that the line between accountability and external coercion had been crossed. The result was an immediate cross-cutting coalition that framed the story not as the fall of an individual, but as an affront to the nation. Second, consider the legal reverberations. Courts and judges exist to interpret law, not to wage politics. When a judge uses the weight of the bench to advocate a specific diplomatic punishment, it blurs essential boundaries. Citizens demand independent judiciaries precisely because they fear the politicization of justice. In this case, many legal professionals, colleagues of the judge, retired jurists and young lawyers alike, raised principled objections. They did not necessarily shield the person under pressure from scrutiny. Rather, they insisted that procedures, evidence standards, and the chain of custody of any proof be publicly audited and tested through recognized forums. The scandal was not simply about whether someone deserved sanction. It was about preserving the rule of law, which depends on procedure as much as on outcome. When procedures are rushed or short-circuited, legitimacy evaporates, and when legitimacy evaporates, enforcement fails. Third, the diplomatic costs mounted. Sanctions rarely act alone. They alter alliances, feed narratives, and provide raw material for those who would use grievance to recruit. The external sponsor of the pressure found itself having to explain not only the evidence, but also the method. Regional governments that value sovereignty bristled. Partners who prefer discreet diplomacy over public coercion grew uneasy. International institutions, whose credibility rests on consistent application of norms, were forced to choose between endorsing the move or denouncing unilateralism. The net effect was not a tightening of pressure, but a loosening of consensus around the tactic. Fourth, economic consequences were immediate and personal. Currency streams shifted, investment teetered, business confidence wavered. It is easy to forget that the instruments of statecraft have human faces, market women who rely on cross-border trade, farmers whose crops feed cities, small shopkeepers whose inventory is priced in hard currency. Sanctions that aim at state elites can, in practice, bleed through to ordinary life, creating hunger, job loss, and hardship for citizens who had no role in the controversy. That reality fueled the backlash. People do not naturally support measures that injure their livelihoods, even when wrapped in moral rhetoric. And yet the backlash was not merely pragmatic, it was profoundly moral. Millions looked at the image of a judge, of an external power pressing down, and felt an old pattern revive, the rhythm of intervention without consent. Memory is long. Communities that had experienced paternalistic policies in the past saw an echo. The call for sanction, however justified the originator might have thought it, triggered the sedimented memory of autonomy denied. The leader who was the explicit target, and the movement that surrounded him, quickly cast the moment in grand moral terms. The nation had been tested, and would not yield its autonomy to external whims. Now the story is complicated. It would be wrong, and easy to caricature the judge as naive, and the leader as blameless. Accountability matters. If abuses occurred, they should be investigated. Rule of law must prevail. Yet what we learned in the unfolding aftermath is that the method of accountability matters as deeply as its aim. The judge pursued a moral imperative to seek justice, but chose a path that elevated spectacle over procedure and immediacy over deliberation. In doing so, he created a polarizing rather than clarifying moment. The second lesson is about the power of narrative. In politics, facts exist, but stories give facts meaning. The judge's action allowed his opponents to craft a powerful narrative. We are being targeted, we are being coerced, and we will stand together. Even if the legal claims had merit, the political framing trumped the technicalities. The leader cast the episode as a matter of sovereignty, dignity, and resistance to external interference. Media, local, regional, and global, amplified the drama. Within days, what was intended as a legal corrective became a rallying cry. Third, the moment exposed weaknesses in our institutions. Where independent investigative capacity exists, controversies can be managed with less collateral damage. Where audit offices, parliamentary committees, and neutral fact-finding bodies are strong and trusted, the need for external pressure shrinks. In the absence of that trust, external actors, however well-intentioned, are tempted to step in. When they do, they replace domestic deliberation with foreign pressure, and that substitution often backfires. The real remedy, then, is institution building, strengthen domestic oversight, protect whistleblowers, fund forensic investigations, and empower neutral observers. Fourth, the episode taught us that the people are less divided than elites assume. We often imagine societies fractured into irreconcilable camps, but when a perceived external affront arrives, citizens find common cause. The cross-cutting solidarity in response to the judge's pressure showed something profound, a baseline patriotism that prefers self-resolution to imposed punishment. That solidarity carries responsibility. Citizens who resist external coercion must also insist on domestic accountability. The moral center of the backlash is not a blank check for impunity. It is a demand that justice be done by the nation's own mechanisms, openly and fairly. What then should our politics learn? First, accountability must be pursued, yes, but through processes that command legitimacy. Evidence should be presented to courts in transparent ways. Parliamentary panels with subpoena powers should examine claims. Independent expert panels, including regional and international experts, can help verify contested facts. Sanctions, when used, should be based on clear findings, proportionate responses, and targeted measures that avoid needless suffering among the innocent. The law must be the tool, not the court of public opinion or diplomatic theater. Second, judges and jurists have special responsibilities. Their authority rests on neutrality. When a judge wades into diplomatic advocacy, the damage is not merely political, it corrodes faith in justice. Judges who choose to speak should do so in ways that strengthen institutions, by calling for investigations, by setting standards, by insisting on due process, not by delivering policy prescriptions that belong to elected branches. The separation of powers exists not to protect officials, but to ensure fairness and to prevent the substitution of one branch's zeal for another's deliberative competence. Third, international actors must be cautious and wise. Sanctions are seductive because they show action where words feel insufficient, but their moral legitimacy evaporates if they are seen as instruments of influence, rather than as responses to clear violations. External powers should support domestic capacities, help set up forensic units, train magistrates, fund civil society monitoring, and bolster Parliament's investigative powers. When outsiders insist on pressing the sanction button before these domestic options have been tried, they risk inflaming rather than remedying. Fourth, leaders targeted by such actions must respond with clarity and openness. If wrongs occurred, own them, investigate and punish. If no wrongs occurred, invite external observers and publish evidence. Silence breeds suspicion, defensiveness breeds grievance, openness builds credibility. A leader's best armor is not defiance alone, but an invitation to scrutiny that demonstrates confidence in the integrity of governance. Fifth, citizens must own the work of accountability. Resistance to external coercion is honorable when it is joined by insistence on domestic justice. The best outcome is not to win a rhetorical victory against foreign pressure, but to establish processes that deliver fair outcomes, a functioning judiciary, transparent procurement, an empowered legislature, and a vigilant press. Civil society must demand both sovereignty and standards. These are not opposites, but complements. Let us also speak of consequence. After the backlash, there were immediate diplomatic recalibrations. Allies reached out to diffuse tensions. Regional bodies convened emergency sessions, not to preach, but to mediate. The threatened sanctions were reviewed, scaled down, and in some cases delayed, pending local investigations. That outcome, messy as it was, offered a silver lining. The crisis provoked rapid momentum for institution building. Parliamentarians who had been inert found a cause. Ministries that had been inattentive found urgency. The blow that was meant to isolate instead catalyzed reform because public pressure demanded it. It is a paradox worth noting. Sometimes the shock of misapplied pressure accelerates reform because no one wants the same mistake repeated. But we must not romanticize the outcome. Lives were hurt, businesses suffered, trust frayed in ways that will require years to rebuild. The episode left scars on our foreign relations. Partners became more cautious, and the shadow of suspicion lengthened. That is why prudence must be the watchword going forward. There are practical steps to take now. First, commission an independent, joint fact-finding mission with regional and international experts, properly resourced and empowered to gather evidence, interview witnesses, and produce a public report. Second, strengthen parliamentary inquiry procedures and ensure they have timely access to documents and testimony. Third, create a permanent, independent anti-corruption office with prosecutorial referral powers and international vetting of its staff. Fourth, establish a victim protection fund to mitigate economic shocks to those harmed by sanctions or by the instability that flowed from the controversy. Fifth, convene a regional summit on the appropriate use of sanctions and external pressure, developing a shared code of conduct that respects sovereignty while enabling accountability. Let us be candid about the broader lesson. In an interconnected world, actions reverberate in unpredictable ways. A well-intentioned push for accountability can, if misapplied, produce outcomes that undermine the very goals it sought to achieve. The remedy is not to avoid accountability, it is to pursue it through robust, legitimate, and transparent channels, building domestic capacity so that the need for external coercion diminishes. And let us speak to the human dimension. The judge who pushed for sanctions was motivated by a conviction that justice had been denied. Many who cheered him felt the moral clarity of taking a stand. That is understandable. Yet conviction without the scaffold of procedure risks injuring the very cause it defends. We must learn to marry moral urgency with institutional discipline. That marriage is the inheritance we must now fashion, the ability to act decisively and fairly without substituting spectacle for evidence. To the citizens who rallied in defense of dignity, remember that dignity is not only the right to be free from external pressure, it is the right to live under accountable government, Use the momentum you created to demand robust domestic oversight. To the judges and legal professionals, guard the independence and the perception of impartiality. Your voice matters most when it articulates standards rather than prescribes policy. To international partners, partner for capacity, not for headlines. And to leaders everywhere, remember that standing up to external pressure is noble, but doing so while opening doors to scrutiny and reform is wiser. History will judge this episode not only by the immediate outcomes, but by what we built afterward. Will we let the shock spiral into cynicism, or will we convert the controversy into a driver of reform? The safer path is the latter. Build the institutions that make external coercion unnecessary. Invest in independent courts, transparent procurement, empowered parliaments, and a vigilant press. Protect the livelihoods that sanctions can unsettle, and design tools that target culpability without harming the innocent. We have seen how a single judicial act, proportional or not, wise or not, can cascade into a national trial of identity, sovereignty, and justice. We have seen how people react not merely to legal arguments, but to the language and optics of power. We have learned that legitimacy is a fragile resource that must be tended with humility and care. And we have been reminded, painfully, that tools meant to secure accountability can, if misused, strengthen those they seek to weaken. So let us go forward with both courage and caution. Insist on accountability, yes, but insist on process. Demand transparency, yes, but demand fairness. Cherish dignity, yes, but build institutions that protect it beyond any one moment of fury or fame. May this episode not be a warning only, but a turning point. May it send us to the hard work of institution building with seriousness and speed. May it remind elites and citizens alike that sovereignty and justice are two sides of the same coin, and that a nation that wants to be free must also be fair. I close with a simple truth: power used without legitimacy will not hold. It may frighten or coerce for a while, but eventually it corrodes the commonwealth upon which power rests. If our aim is a just society, we must not merely punish, we must also perfect the means of punishment so that they are themselves just. That is the work before us, to align our instruments with our ideals, so that our pursuit of justice does not become an occasion for injustice, and so that our defense of dignity does not become a cover for impunity. Let us do that work together, with honesty, with humility, and with unflagging commitment to the rule of law. My friends, misapplied accountability backfires because the shape of justice matters as much as its intention. When accountability is pursued through tools that bypass trusted processes or that signal foreign interference, the result is often the opposite of what was intended. Instead of correcting wrongs, it hardens loyalties, erodes legitimacy, and sows chaos. Accountability is a craft. It requires evidence, procedure, proportionality, and above all, methods that the community accepts as fair. When those elements are missing, even righteous aims collapse into counterproductive spectacle. Consider the texture of legitimacy. Citizens accept outcomes when they believe the path to those outcomes was open, impartial, and competently executed. A sudden push for extraterritorial sanctions, however well motivated, can read to many as an imposed verdict rather than an earned judgment. It substitutes foreign imprimatur for domestic adjudication and thereby invites a reflexive defense of sovereignty. People will rally not only to protect an individual, but to defend the right of their institutions and their nation to resolve disputes through their own channels. The very accountability intended to discipline becomes a rallying cry against perceived external overreach. Practical consequences amplify this dynamic. Sanctions and other blunt instruments rarely isolate elites without collateral damage. They disrupt trade, freeze assets used by ordinary businesses, and unsettle markets. When moms, market vendors, and taxi drivers feel the squeeze, public sympathy shifts from abstract concerns about governance to concrete concerns about survival. What began as a moral campaign can therefore be reframed as an attack on livelihoods, and the moral clarity of the initial action is lost in the fog of economic pain. Procedural integrity is the antidote. Present evidence through competent domestic channels first, empower parliamentary inquiries, and invite neutral international experts when capacity is lacking. When investigations are transparent, when facts are auditable, and when remedies are proportionate, External actors are less likely to resort to unilateral pressure, and citizens are less likely to see such pressure as an affront. There is also a caution for institutions. Zeal without safeguards corrodes authority. Judges, prosecutors, and oversight bodies must guard against converting moral indignation into policy prescriptions that belong to elected executives and diplomats. The separation of powers exists to protect both liberty and fairness. Violating it damages not just a case, but public trust in all branches of government. Finally, accountability that sticks is accountable to the people. It is visible, repeatable, and predictable. It punishes the guilty but preserves institutions, so the next issue will be judged by the same rules. Misapplied accountability, by contrast, trades short-term spectacle for long-term instability. If we seek justice that endures, we must insist on methods that command consent, limit collateral harm, and strengthen rather than fracture the civic bond. My friends, sovereignty is not a mere slogan on a flag. It is the lived reality that a people decide their fate through their own institutions. But sovereignty is also vulnerable to perception. In politics, optics are not trivial. They shape how actions are understood, how publics react, and whether outcomes build legitimacy or fuel resistance. When external actors or powerful domestic voices act in ways that look like imposition rather than invitation, the image created can overwhelm the substance of any legal or moral argument. That is why sovereignty and optics matter, and why statesmen must manage both with care. Begin with dignity. People respond to how an action feels as much as to what it does. A measure framed as accountability can be read as humiliation if presented without clear process and consultation. Citizens ask, who decided, by what right, and on whose evidence? If the answer appears external or opaque, the instinct is to defend national prerogative. That reflex is not merely pride. It is a political immune response designed to protect the space where domestic deliberation should occur. Poor optics turn legitimate concerns into perceived assaults on identity. Next, consider strategic effect. Actions perceived as breaches of sovereignty create rallying points for elites and masses alike. Instead of isolating a target, they can produce a coalition of defenders drawn from unlikely corners, opposition groups, business associations, religious leaders, united by the need to protect national autonomy. The optics of external pressure become a political wind that strengthens, rather than weakens, the very forces it intends to discipline. Third, diplomacy depends on credibility. States that appear to habitually override other nations' prerogatives lose soft power and moral standing. Even justified steps risk backfiring if they are seen as selective or instrumental. Careful diplomacy invests in quiet persuasion, shared fact-finding, and multilateral channels that preserve the dignity of the affected state while addressing wrongdoing. Optics managed poorly cost relationships that are costly to rebuild. Fourth, institutional trust is at stake. When external actions appear to short-circuit domestic processes, citizens lose faith in their institutions' ability to deliver justice. The visual of a foreign sanction or a public referral can do more to delegitimize local oversight than any internal failure. Strengthening visible, credible domestic mechanisms, parliaments, courts, auditors, reduces the temptation for outsiders to act and improves the optics when they do. Finally, morality requires prudence. The most righteous cause can be undone by careless presentation. To protect both justice and sovereignty, pursue transparency, proportionality, and partnership. Publish evidence where possible. Prefer targeted measures that spare civilians, and build regional coalitions that legitimize action. When optics and sovereignty are honored together, accountability becomes not an imposition, but an act of collective repair. In short, attend to dignity, shape perceptions, fortify institutions, and choose methods that respect both law and national self-respect. Sovereignty is defended not only by borders and ballots, but by doing justice in ways the public can see and accept. My friends, when our institutions are weak, porous, or mistrusted, we do more than invite dysfunction at home, we invite intervention from abroad. External actors do not step into vacuum. They step into openings created by fragile courts, politicized parliaments, hollow oversight bodies, and opaque procurement systems. Institutional weakness signals to outsiders that problems can be fixed faster by pressure than by partnership, and that temptation too often becomes action. First, weak institutions fail to resolve disputes credibly. When allegations of wrongdoing pile up and domestic mechanisms appear incapable of investigating them impartially, the international community and other states look for alternatives. They may propose sanctions, investigative panels, or even unilateral measures, not necessarily because they seek dominance, but because they see a governance gap they believe must be filled. That gap, however, costs national autonomy. A robust, transparent judiciary and empowered oversight offices make outside coercion unnecessary. They supply the evidence, the process, and the visible outcomes that reassure partners and citizens alike. Second, corruption and opacity are invitations. When procurement is secretive, when beneficial owners are hidden behind shell companies, and when public contracts are awarded without competitive processes, outsiders assume risk, and some will act to mitigate it in blunt ways. Conversely, consistent transparency, open contracts, published audits, and accessible public registers reduces suspicion and keeps disputes within domestic channels where remedies are more measured and legitimate. Third, institutional weakness exacerbates humanitarian risk. External actors often justify intervention by pointing to human suffering, failed services, or state collapse. Strong public health institutions, accountable social services, and reliable safety nets blunt that argument. When citizens can see functioning clinics, predictable social payments, and timely disaster response, the moral case for external coercion diminishes because the state demonstrates capacity and care. Fourth, weak institutions erode domestic trust, and that vacuum is fertile ground for external narratives. When citizens doubt their courts or parliament, foreign voices offering quick fixes can gain traction. Strengthening civic institutions, protecting independent media, funding watchdog NGOs, and ensuring civil society participation in oversight yields internal resilience against outside manipulation. Finally, the remedy is domestic and urgent. Invest in judiciary independence, adequately fund anti-corruption units with safeguards against politicization, professionalize audit offices, digitize public procurement, and legislate beneficial ownership transparency. Train parliamentarians to perform meaningful oversight and protect whistleblowers with real protections. These are technical but transformative measures. They close openings, raise the cost of external coercion, and restore the people's sight that their affairs can be handled at home. Institutional strength is the best hedge against unwanted intervention. It preserves sovereignty not by shutting doors, but by fixing what makes doors appear ajar. Let us build institutions worthy of our people's trust so that our destiny is settled here, by us for us. My friends, sanctions are often sold as precise instruments of justice, a way to punish leaders without firing a shot. But in practice, they are blunt tools that seldom strike only the powerful. Their force radiates outward, and too often the ones who suffer most are ordinary people. Market vendors, teachers, farmers, and parents who must feed their children. We must therefore be honest about the human cost of coercive measures and temper moral certainty with caution and care. First, consider markets and livelihoods. Modern economies are webs of small transactions. Freeze a few accounts, restrict a few firms, or close access to banking corridors, and the ripple travels fast. Imports of fertilizer stall, trucks sit idle at border posts, and the price of food rises. Families on thin margins cut meals and withdraw children from school. A sanction intended to punish a political actor can quickly become a sentence for the poorest households. Second, think of public services. Governments often rely on external financing, trade revenue, and banking links to pay teachers, nurses, and pensioners. When financial flows tighten, bureaucracies do not pause elegantly. Salaries are delayed, clinics run short of medicines, and maintenance on water systems halts. The very citizens the sanction seekers claim to protect become collateral victims of a strategy meant to discipline. Third, sanctions distort incentives and empower rent seekers. When formal channels close, informal ones widen. Smugglers and monopolists step into gaps, raising prices and capturing the rents that used to be distributed more equally. Those with the means circumvent restrictions, leaving ordinary people to bear the burden. Economic pain becomes a platform for social fracture and opportunistic exploitation. Fourth, the humanitarian dimension must not be abstracted. Food security, healthcare, and access to clean water are moral imperatives that cannot be suspended for political theater. Even targeted sanctions must include robust, enforceable humanitarian carve-outs. In practice, however, paperwork, over-compliance by banks, and fear of secondary penalties frequently block life-saving supplies long before any legal intent to harm is realized. Fifth, there are long-term developmental costs, emergency shocks, lost harvests, closed factories, disrupted schooling, produce scarring, skills unlearned, businesses shuttered, and trust in institutions eroded. Recovery is possible, but it is slower and more painful than the swift justice sanctioners promise. So what should guide us? Design measures narrowly and transparently, include clear humanitarian exemptions, monitor impacts continually, and pair pressure with institution building that addresses the root causes of the wrongdoing. Above all, remember that justice that destroys livelihoods is self-defeating. True accountability must protect the vulnerable even as it pursues the culpable. My friends, durable accountability requires a process because justice that springs from spectacle will never hold when the lights go out. Accountability is not merely the naming of guilt, it is the building of systems that test, verify, and when necessary punish in ways the public accepts as fair. Processes create legitimacy, procedures create predictability. Predictability makes outcomes durable. Without process, even righteous outcomes are fragile. Begin with transparent fact-finding. Evidence must be collected methodically, preserved securely, and exposed to scrutiny by qualified, neutral experts. That means forensic audits, chain of custody protocols, and independent commissions with clear mandates. When findings are the product of rigorous methods, they survive partisan attacks and form the basis of credible action. Secrecy, by contrast, breeds suspicion and rumor, and suspicion corrodes both justice and social peace. Next, ensure institutional separation. Investigation, prosecution, adjudication, and oversight should be handled by distinct, competent bodies so no single actor can both accuse and judge. Separation reduces conflicts of interest and allows each institution to specialize and improve. It also means that when mistakes are made, they can be corrected through appeal and review rather than spiraling into delegitimizing crises. Third, design proportional remedies. Accountability is not a binary of punishment or impunity. It requires calibrated measures that match the harm and the evidence, targeted sanctions, restorative programs that repair communities, administrative sanctions for earlier reform, and criminal prosecution when thresholds are met. Proportionality reduces backlash and keeps the focus on correcting wrongs rather than scoring political points. Fourth, protect due process and rights. The accused must have access to counsel, the right to respond, and mechanisms to challenge evidence. Rights are not privileges that protect the powerful alone. They are the guardrails that keep justice from becoming vengeance. When citizens see fairness applied even to those they dislike, trust in institutions grows, and trust is the currency of durable legitimacy. Fifth, engage the public continuously. Transparency is not a single press release. It is ongoing communication, publication of reports, open hearings, accessible summaries in local languages, and civic forums, parliamentary oversight, civil society monitors, and protected whistleblower channels keep processes honest and responsive. Participation turns accountability from an elite spectacle into a shared civic practice. Finally, institutionalize learning. Set up independent evaluations, publish lessons learned, and reform procedures based on evidence. Create training pipelines so investigators, prosecutors, judges, and auditors gain the technical skills they need. Durable accountability is iterative. It improves with feedback and resists capture when exposed to critique. If we want justice that lasts, we must favor architecture over theatrics, procedure over impulse, and durability over drama. Build processes that can be seen, tested, and improved, and the people will trust the outcomes even when those outcomes bite hard. That trust is the real safeguard of sovereignty, stability, and the rule of law.